Unit 7, The Truman Doctrine to the Berlin Airlift. Learning objective. Please read along with me. Economics. Assess how America's involvement in World War II reshaped both domestic and international economies, and examine how post-war American affluence transformed the country. Politics and law. Discuss the U.S.'s broad political reasons for entering World War II and how those motivations and wartime experiences informed post-war policies and the Cold War. Lesson agenda. I do. Introduction. We do. Guided reading. You do. Check for understanding and independent practice. Introduction. Containment. During the Cold War, the United States developed the policy of containment to limit expansion of Soviet influence and prevent the spread of communism. The policy of containment was a response to the Soviet Union's aggressive actions in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. A policy of containment was first articulated by George F. Kennan, a U.S. diplomat stationed in Moscow in 1946. Kennan sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department outlining the Soviet Union's expansionist ambitions and the need for a strategy of containment to prevent the spread of communism. Kennan's long telegram became the basis of the policy of containment adopted by President Harry Truman and became the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. In this lesson, we will explore the political crisis that arose following the end of World War II in relation to the spread of communism and Soviet influence, and the steps that the U.S. government took to contain them. Guided reading. Crisis in Iran. While the Truman administration was still considering and weighing Kennan's ideas, a series of crises occurred during the spring and summer of 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II. These crises seemed to confirm Kennan's statements on the character of the Soviets. The first crisis began in Iran. During World War II, the United States had troops in southern Iran, while the Soviets had troops in northern Iran to secure a supply from the Persian Gulf. After the war, the Soviets had not withdrawn from northern Iran as they had promised. Stalin then began demanding access to Iran's oil supplies. In addition, Soviet troops helped local communists in northern Iran start a separate government. U.S. officials saw these actions as the Soviets' way to gain influence in the Middle East. The U.S. Secretary of State sent Stalin a strong message telling the Soviet forces to withdraw. At the same time, the battleship USS Missouri sailed into the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The pressure seemed to work. The Soviet forces withdrew. The Soviets were promised a share in Soviet-Iranian oil company, but the Iranian parliament later rejected the plan. The Truman Doctrine. Having withdrawn from Iran, Stalin turned northwest to Turkey. A key route from Soviet ports on the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea went through the Strait of the Dardanelles. For centuries, Russia had wanted to control this important route. In August 1946, Stalin demanded joint control of the Dardanelles with Turkey. President Truman ordered the USS Missouri and a new aircraft carrier, the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, to help secure Turkey and the eastern Mediterranean. In August 1946, Greek communists started a guerrilla war against the Greek government. Guerrilla warfare is a form of combat where small groups of combatants, civilians, or irregulars use such military tactics as ambushes, sabotage, raids, hit and run, and petty warfare to fight a larger and less mobile traditional military. The United Kingdom intervened, sending troops to help Greeks fight the communist guerrillas. However, by February 1947, Britain informed the United States that they could no longer afford to help Greece because of its weak post-war economy. Shortly after, Truman went before Congress to deliver a speech that outlined his policy, which became known as the Truman Doctrine. He went on to ask Congress for $400 million to combat communist aggression in Greece and Turkey. Truman's goal was to aid those who had worked against being controlled by others. Ultimately, it committed the United States to fight the spread of communism worldwide. Marshall Plan. Meanwhile, post-war Western Europe faced grave problems. Economies were ruined, people faced starvation, and political chaos was at hand. In June 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed the European Recovery Plan, or Marshall Plan, which would give European nations American aid to rebuild their economies. Truman saw both the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine as essential for containment. Marshall offered help to all nations planning a recovery program. Although the Marshall Plan was offered to the Soviet Union and its satellite nations, the Soviets rejected it and developed their own economic program. This action further separated Europe into competing regions. The Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars in supplies, machinery, and food into Western Europe. The region's recovery weakened the appeal of communism and opened new markets for trade. In his 1949 inaugural address, Truman proposed assistance for underdeveloped countries outside of the war zone. The Point 4 program aimed to provide them with scientific advances and industrial progress for their improvement and growth. The Marshall Plan was highly successful and helped rebuild Western Europe after the devastation of the war. The Department of State administered the program until its merger with other foreign aid programs in 1953. The Berlin Airlift. Truman and his advisors believed Western Europe's prosperity depended on Germany's recovery. The Soviets, however, still wanted Germany to pay reparations. This dispute brought the nations to the brink of war. By early 1948, American officials had concluded that the Soviets were trying to undermine Germany's economy. In response, the United States, Britain, and France merged their German zones and allowed the Germans to have their own government, creating the Federal Republic of Germany, which became known as West Germany. They also agreed to merge their zones in Berlin and make West Berlin part of West Germany. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The Soviet zone was neither democratic nor a republic, but in fact a totalitarian dictatorship. West Germany was mostly independent, but not allowed to have a military. The creation of West Germany convinced the Soviets that they would never get the reparations they wanted. In June 1948, Soviet troops blockaded West Berlin, hoping to force the United States to reconsider its decision or abandon West Berlin. Truman sent bombers capable of carrying atomic weapons to bases in Britain. Hoping to avoid war with the Soviets, he ordered the Air Force to fly supplies into Berlin rather than troops. The Berlin airlift began in June 1948 and continued to the spring of 1949, bringing in more than 2 million tons of supplies into the city. Stalin finally lifted the blockade on May 12, 1949. The airlift symbolized American determination to contain communism and not give in to Soviet demands. Other means of containment. The policy of containment was implemented in various ways during the Cold War. The United States had established military alliances such as NATO to deter Soviet aggression, but the United States also engaged in covert operations, such as the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. The United States also provided military and economic aid to countries such as South Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan to prevent them from falling under Soviet influence. Criticisms. The policy of containment was not without its critics. Some argued that the policy was too aggressive and risked provoking a war with the Soviet Union. Others argued that the policy was too passive and did not do enough to promote democracy and human rights. Despite these criticisms, the policy of containment remained the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Check for understanding. What was the main goal of the policy of containment? Who first articulated the policy of containment? What was the Truman Doctrine? What was the Marshall Plan? What was the purpose of the Berlin airlift? What was the cause of the crisis in Iran in 1946? How did the United States respond to the crisis in Iran? Why did the United States provide aid to Greece and Turkey? What was the purpose of the Point 4 program? How did the Marshall Plan contribute to containment? Independent Practice, Part 1. Directions. On your own paper, copy the chart below. Complete the chart by describing the crisis in that country and the American response. See the example provided. Country, Iran. Summary of crisis. Soviet troops never left Iran after World War II, and Stalin's demand for access to Iran's oil. American response. U.S. demands Soviet withdrawal from Iran, but they don't leave. The U.S. sends a battleship to Iran to force them to leave. Independent Practice, Part 2. Directions. Use the information in the passages above to summarize key ideas and events from the lesson. End of lesson. Please make sure your name, date, and class period are in the upper right-hand corner of your paper. Turn your completed assignment into your class's assignment tray.